Today, we're digging into a fascinating local story from Blaine, Washington. It's a case where a city government's official narrative went head to head with the public record. You'll see how two totally different versions of the same events can pop up, and it all kicks off with some really intense language. So, right out of the gate, you have this quote from Blaine's mayor, and it just immediately frames the entire conflict. Look, we're not talking about a simple disagreement on policy here. The official language is throwing around words like traitors and a plot to destroy the city. That creates a super high stakes atmosphere from the very beginning. And this really gets us to the heart of it all. On one side, you've got the city's official story. And on the other, you have a group of citizens who were just trying to get information they believe they had a fundamental right to see. So here are the two competing ways of looking at this. The city painted this picture of a small, organized group that was just causing trouble, harassing people and wasting taxpayer money. But the citizens, well, they saw themselves as just asking for transparency and accountability, exercising their basic rights. A really key part of the city's message was framing these requests for public records as a direct hit to public services. The idea was that by asking for information, these citizens were taking money right out of the pockets of the food bank or the police. And that's a tactic that can be really effective at turning public opinion against people who are just asking questions. But there's a really powerful counter-argument here from the Washington Coalition for Open Government. They basically said, hold on. The conflict and all the money spent didn't start because citizens asked for things. It started because the city didn't provide the records. So from this point of view, the real issue was a lack of transparency right from the start. Okay, so let's start to break down the official story, starting with this idea of a single organized group. It's almost always easier to build a narrative against one kind of shadowy entity than it is to deal with the real concerns of a bunch of different individual people. And this is pretty much how that narrative got built. A local newspaper article came out and said that two groups, Save Blaine and the Blaine Water Coalition, were one and the same. But when you look at the public record, that just wasn't accurate. They were different people with different concerns who were basically lumped together to create a single target. So what exactly was the Blaine Water Coalition? Was it some formal permanent organization? Nope. It was just an unincorporated group of volunteers. You can think of it more like a brand name for a specific project. People who were concerned about local water resources. That's really all it was. All right, the next big piece of the city's story centers on a public records lawsuit. It was presented as this malicious campaign of harassment. But the question is, does the actual timeline of what happened support that claim? Well, the timeline seems to tell a different story. The lawsuit was filed on August 8th, really as a last-ditch effort to get some documents. There was only one hearing. And by September 5th, the whole thing was withdrawn by the citizen. That looks a lot less like some long, drawn-out harassment campaign and more like a very specific, short-term legal action. Now, to really get what happened in that one hearing, we need to know this legal term, pro se. All it means is that you're representing yourself in court without a lawyer, which is exactly what the citizen who filed the suit was doing. And this is so important. The judge's ruling wasn't actually about whether the lawsuit had any merit. It was dismissed on a procedural technicality. The judge simply said that the citizen, because they were acting pro se, couldn't legally represent a group. The actual substance of the case, it was never even debated in court. So where did this whole disruptive label even come from? It looks like it was lifted from a police report, where an officer used the phrase deliberately disruptive. Now, that was the officer's personal opinion. It wasn't a legal finding. But that phrase got pulled out of context and used to build this much bigger and pretty misleading narrative. The media's role in all of this is also part of the record. When the citizen involved in that lawsuit tried to correct a misleading article, the local newspaper's publisher basically refused. In an email, the publisher brought up that old saying about how a person who represents themselves has a fool for a client, and then added that some people even use the word idiot instead. It's a response that really suggests an effort to control the story, not just report on it. So after all of this, the name-calling, the misleading reports, everything, what was the final outcome? Did this whole fight for public records just fizzle out and amount to nothing like the official story suggested? Well, the public record gives us a really clear answer. An independent, impartial hearing examiner looked at the whole case and ordered the City of Blaine to hand over the documents it had been holding back. And what was the result? Over 100 critical documents that the city had fought to keep private were finally released to the public. This really validated the citizens' efforts. It showed they weren't just on some wild goose chase. And look, these weren't just random, trivial papers. They contained exactly the kind of stuff the public has a right to know. Serious concerns from the state's Department of Ecology, reports about unmaintained stormwater ponds, key emails between engineers, and details on sewer costs that literally affect every single taxpayer in that city. So let's zoom out for a second and look at why this local story actually matters way beyond this one town. It really is a classic case study of what happens when an official story collides with a public record. The difference is just so stark, isn't it? The official story talked about a disruptive group and a lawsuit that was bordering on criminal. But the public record? It shows individual citizens using standard legal channels to get information, in a case that was ultimately just dismissed on a technicality. Ultimately, this whole story is bigger than Blaine. It's bigger than any single development project. At its core, this is about the fundamental right that every single one of us has to access public information and to hold our own government accountable. That's the principle that was really on the line here. This story is just a powerful reminder of why that right to know is so critical. And it leaves us with a pretty important question to think about in our own communities. How transparent is your local government really?